So the claim is basically that monotheism originated with Akhenaten, who's some pharaohs like figure in Egypt, right?
Yes, that's what it
The,
was.
the claim itself is such a bizarre claim, and we have so much of evidence that's out there.
We have the evidence from all around the world outside of Egypt to show that monotheism is more ancient and original. Evidence, internal Egyptian evidence as well.
Yeah.
So you have these monotheistic undercurrents or remnants or legacies there, regardless of Akhenaten. So even within the framework of Egyptian history, it's impossible he was the first monotheist.
Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts. And today we have another groundbreaking topic for all of you. Today's topic is going to be an extension of what we have covered previously in many of our discussions. And today's guest, okay, he does not need an introduction at all. He's our brother, Gerry Coghlan. He is part of Incisive Thoughts and actually an integral part within our research. And I would actually give you the opportunity this time to explain us what exactly the topic is.
Okay, that's
So, welcome to Incisive Thoughts.
Assalamu alaikum, Khalid.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
So this video is basically, it's a refutation of something quite particular. It's the idea that monotheism came from Akhenaten, or Akhenaten, the Egyptian pharaoh, the ancient Egyptian pharaoh, was the first proponent of monotheism. Now, the evidence for this is not actually quite strong, but it does crop up regularly, especially on YouTube. Like, there's a number of videos that you come across without looking for them that propose this idea. So that's why I've just decided to do a little refutation of it. But as I said, the evidence for it, there's nothing really weighty behind it anyway. But it's a bit of a frequent, it turns up frequently, so to say.
Okay. So the claim is basically that monotheism originated with Akhenaten, who's some pharaohs like figure in Egypt, right?
Yes, that's what it was.
The claim itself is such a bizarre claim, and we have so much of evidence that's out there, predating all of the Egyptian civilization, which actually points to monotheism, points to a supreme being like a god. But still, yeah, I'm really interested to know, how do we start refuting this claim? The claim itself seems bizarre to me.
Yes, so the first way I would do it is to highlight that monotheism being more ancient can be demonstrated from various different parts of the globe, if not every part. I mean, I don't mean every single village or every localized area, but every large area of the globe, such as China, India, the Tierra del Fuegians in South America, so on and so forth. If you analyze the movement of religion in these areas through history, anthropology, archaeology and whatnot, you'll find that the evidence points clearly to monotheism being older and original, and anything other than monotheism being later and a deviation. Like, for example, there's Chinese texts which are older than Akhenaten, which scholars have analysed to say that there are hints of monotheism in these texts, if not more than hints, and these kind of hints disappear as you go forward in time through the Chinese canon. So it's literally impossible Akhenaten could have influenced China whatsoever anyway. And it becomes more ridiculous when the texts analysed are older than him. It's also impossible that he could have influenced the Tierra del Fuegians, who were on the tip of South America, various different indigenous tribes from the south of India right up to the Bangladeshi border. And I suppose, as we don't have time to go into this again today, we can just refer people back to the two earliest videos I did on the channel. One is called The Legacy of Monotheism, and the other one is called, what was the Fitra video called?
Yeah. Evidence of Fitra all around the world, something around.
Yes. So the first two videos, and by themselves, these are enough for anyone with a bit of common sense to remove the idea that Akhenaten was the first monotheist. Even the first video was enough by itself anyway, without even touching on anything specific to Akhenaten.
Right.
So I assume many will have already seen those videos, but if you haven't, you can go back and watch. And if you have, all you need to do is apply a bit of common sense. And Akhenaten's being the first proponent of monotheism is dust.
So why do people make this claim? Like, what is the reason behind making such a bizarre claim that, okay, monotheism originated here?
It's basically because what the Pharaoh Akhenaten did later on in life, after a few years after taking the reins, taking the rule of Egypt, he elevated one particular god over and above all the others. Now, this wasn't an unusual practice in Egypt. It was something quite regular and done with different gods. But he became quite vehement against one priesthood and one god in particular, and to a lesser extent the other gods. So whereas before, people in particular villages, towns or cities would have a henotheistic view of one particular god, they wouldn't really bother with the worshippers of other gods, so to speak. They wouldn't deny them or just wouldn't really bother with them. But Akhenaten, he became determined to wipe out the priesthood of Amun, and he was quite vehement against them, like smashing their monuments and removing the name of Amun and taking power away from the priesthood. But we'll see why he did that. So they view him as like a revolutionary monotheist, and they even have crazy unsupported theories that he influenced the children of Israel when they were in Egypt, and that gave rise to the monotheism of the Old Testament, and so on and so forth.
Oh, I get it now. Yeah.
So there's actually a different opinion on whether Akhenaten said other gods were not to be worshipped, because there's no textual refutation of this. He just persecuted the followers, like I say, particularly of one priesthood, and demolished their temples.
Okay. And I believe Akhenaten, like, of course, my knowledge within this subject is very thin, but from what I came across, there are debates that he on the subject that was he even a monotheist or not. Like, we are not even like many people are not even sure if he's actually can he be actually categorized within the category of monotheism or not. So that is also a debatable subject.
It's highly debatable. Even if he was, he kind of directed all the worship of the Aten through himself, and he elevated his himself and his family to like at least semi-divine status. But when you see the reasons why he did this, his revolution becomes less of a theological thing and more of a political thing anyway.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so let's dive deep into his bio and understand why it came from.
Yeah. So Akhenaten was born in approximately 1380 BC. His name was originally Amenhotep, which means the god Amun is pleased. He reigned as pharaoh from roughly 1353 to 1336. And in year 5 of his reign, he changed his name to Akhenaten, which means servant of Aten, or effective for Aten. So he took Amenhotep, he abandoned this name, which means the god Amun is pleased, and he changed his name to servant of Aten, which was the god he trumped over all the others. the former capital of Egypt at Thebes had been dedicated to Amun-Ra, the sun god and the head of the Egyptian pantheon, at least for some. However, Amenhotep abandoned the idea that this god was supreme, and he elevated the Aten to being supreme, and he even built a whole new capital called Akhenaten, which means the horizon of Aten, which is now known as Amarna. So if you hear me say Amarna or Akhenaten, it's the same place, just the ancient name and the modern name. He chose the solar deity Aten, typically represented as a sun disk, to be not just the god of the city, but all of Egypt. And now where he differed, like as I said, the elevation of one god over the others, like in a kind of henotheistic sense, was pretty standard in Egypt, as we'll see as we dip into the theology more. But where he differed was how he applied this, because he became quite staunch in closing of temples dedicated to other deities. He confiscated their treasures, and he was most staunch against the god Amun and the priesthood of Amun, which is why he took the capital away from Thebes. So they were a very influential priesthood, especially the high priests, to whom religious duties of previous pharaohs had been delegated. And it was said that the chief priest of Amun-Ra in Thebes, he had so much power and authority that he could even jeopardize the rule of the pharaoh, especially in the final stages of the new kingdom. And these temples were important centers of economy, education, and culture. So they were like hubs for everything, basically. They weren't just places where people went to worship. And the reason it's said that he was most harsh against the priesthood of Amun is because as Pharaoh, he obviously had the administrative, the political, and the military power, but he wanted it all. So he wanted to take the religious power away from the priesthood of Amun and to himself as well. So they say he basically had a totalitarian mindset, because while there was some level of enmity against the other gods and temples, it was basically focused on the priesthood of Amun. Eric Klein, professor of classical and ancient Near Eastern studies at George Washington University, said, talking about after Akhenaten, Egyptians could only worship the Aten from then on, at least in theory, but not directly. By positioning his patron as the sole deity and himself as an earthly representation of the sun disk, Akhenaten eliminated the power of Egypt's priests altogether and became the supreme ruler. He's already the supreme commander administratively, now he's the main guy religiously as well. He's in control of everything. That's what his intention was. And theologically, he placed the Aten as a kind of removed or remote god, at least from others, who required an intermediary to access.
Oh.
Now, during the New Kingdom, intermediaries between the people and gods were a regular thing. However, they used to have a variety of these. But of course, Akhenaten done away with this as well. He made himself the sole intermediary. So it seems he took worship for himself as well and his family to at least some extent in between.
So he wants full power and full authority.
Yeah, he wants the lot. He wants the lot.
So if you want to talk to God also, come to me.
Yes.
Okay. I get it, yeah.
Although almost in all cases he speaks of himself as subordinate to Aten, he refers to himself as the only son of Aten and the only one who knows Aten. There is no one else who knows you. So eventually the doctrine has been revealed to him and him only, and he becomes the sole link or intermediary between the population and Aten, at least in his own mind, but it didn't work out like this. A British Egyptologist, Dominic Montserrat, says that Akhenaten's status as a religious revolutionary has led to much speculation, ranging from scholarly hypotheses to non-academic fringe theories. And that's basically what the idea that he was the first monotheist falls under. It's a very fringe theory. Although some believe the religion he introduced was mostly monotheistic, many others see Akhenaten as a practitioner of Akhenaten monolatry, as he did not actively deny the existence of the other gods. He simply refrained from worshipping any except Aten, while expecting the people to worship not Aten but him. And he built a temple, he purpose-built a temple in the new capital to serve as like the focal point of his reform, you could say. Evidence shows that he didn't suppress traditional worship outside of Amarna, this new capital. It continued.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, but some parts of Upper Egypt, which were under his control, they took on some aspects of Atenism, but it was less pervasive due to like local traditions being entrenched in the psyche and the daily lives of the people, you know. So his reforms were top down, starting with the elites, the court officials, the nobility, the artisans, etc. It says that rural communities in distant provinces likely continued traditional practices with little disruption. And this is where it gets really interesting. Even the workman's village at Amarna, which was the center of Aten and his revolution, even here, the evidence of the worship of all the other gods in the pantheon has been found. So this was still going on, even though in his mind it may not have been, or at least he didn't want it to. Like the standard Egyptian polytheism was still going on anyway, regardless.
So it seems like he's targeting the political threats, like, you know, what can be a political threat to him or his kind of idea. That is what he's targeting, not the local people and what they are doing. He's not bothered much by what they have to do.
No, or even
Which
if
means
it was, he probably realized he couldn't do anything about that anyway. But he actually sent the high priest of Amun on a mission to the middle of nowhere. So he basically banished him unofficially. He got rid of him like this. But this was the guy or the position that tended to trouble pharaohs in the Middle Kingdom. You know, that's how much power the priesthood of Amun has there.
Okay.
Then there was a German Egyptologist called Jan Assmann, who agrees that Akhenaten was doing what he was doing for totalitarian reasons. So he says Atenism denoted the idea of a universal religion, according to which Aten was the god besides whom there was no other. Now it does say that in the hymn to Akhenaten, but in other hymns to other gods it says this as well. So sometimes this is not meant literally throughout Egyptian history, but it does say that. But because of other factors, some scholars say it's not meant literally. So Aslan then says Akhenaten ousted and got rid of a large part of the old officialdom, and he brought into court officials, military officers and priests who did not descend from the upper class or even were foreigners. So he was raising allies who would be completely loyal to him. He abandoned the old capital in Thebes, like I said, and founded a new royal capital, Akhenaten, meaning the horizon of Aten, now known as Amarna. It was a solitary site, no ties to the cults of other gods, like by design, but obviously the local people there did keep to the old polytheism. And he set out as a countermeasure to destroy the cult of Amun in the 5th year of his reign at the latest. Attempts were made to erase the name of Amun from inscriptions everywhere in order to doom it to oblivion. The enmity was extended to the other gods, but less so. Accordingly, it appears that the scholars who have tried to demonstrate Akhenaten used the cult of Aten to suppress priests of Amun-Ra and restore supremacy of royal power may substantially be right in this line of thinking. In short, it can be assumed that Akhenaten was heading towards an early totalitarian system of government. And then there's some comments that Akhenaten never managed to impose Atenism or convert the local people to Athenism. Some potential reasons given are he simply wasn't in power long enough to change popular religious practices at a fundamental level. So the Egyptians have been continuing as they were for like thousands of years. And in his brief reign, he simply didn't have enough time or power to fundamentally change things, although he most likely wanted to. And he said, yet even if he had been given a greater amount of time, the largely impersonal and highly esoteric nature of Athenism was likely fairly indecipherable to the average Egyptian. There was a lack of cultic ritual for people to be involved in, no sweeping narrative, no parables, no interesting divine stories to capture the attention and loyalty of worshippers.
Okay.
So that was his intention, according to many, many scholars. It was purely political, under a religious garb, what he did to the priests of Amun, and how he basically, like he had himself and his family carved onto many inscriptions underneath the sun disk, which was the symbol of Aten. And this was unknown in Egyptian history as well, for people to do this. But he had himself, his wife, and his daughters carved onto many inscriptions. And as others have said, it seemed he wanted to be worshipped in some way, shape, or form, at least as the link between everyone else in Aten, whom only he knows. We can now have a brief look at the reach of his efforts in space and time. So the strongest opinion is that after Akhenaten and before Tutankhamun, there may have been 1 or 2 year period where there was a successor or two. There's a difference of opinion. But even if there were, they didn't change anything anyway. It's said that they may have held to some elements of Atenism, although this is not concrete. But even if they did, no real effect. So later on, there was Tutankhamun, who initiated basically, he did to Akhenaten what Akhenaten did to priests of Amun. He began to deface and demolish everything Akhenaten did, and to start removing it not only from present consciousness, but to remove all trace of Akhenaten from history as well. So, interestingly, Tutankhamun also changed his name. His name was Tutankhaten first. So his name included the name of Aten, but he changed his name to Tutankhamun, which is going back to the worship of
back to the previous god. Yeah. I remember
Tutan means living image, so he changed his name to living image of Aten, the living image of Amun. So he did the exact thing to Akhenaten, you see?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember, one video I was watching, one presentation by James K. Hoffmeyer. He's also a researcher in this, and we don't necessarily agree with whatever he has to say. But one thing interesting he mentioned was that, Akhenaten made the previous god, all the impact that Akhenaten had was making the previous god great again, basically, because after he went, after he passed away, people started glorifying that god even more or something like that after his, him passing away.
Yeah.
So that is what he was highlighting.
There was a pushback on top of his pushback, So Tutankhamun is related to Akhenaten. Some say he's actually his son. Others say he's not his son, but he's a close relative. And there's various different opinions on that, but it's not really, it doesn't really matter for our purposes anyway. He ascended the throne as a child anyway. I suppose everyone heard of Tutankhamun. He's really famous, probably the most famous pharaoh. And very early in his reign, likely under the influence of senior advisors, he changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, signaling a return to the worship of Amun. By the second or third year of his reign, he issued what's called the Restoration Stela. This was to formally reinstate the worship of Amun and the other gods, and to condemn Akhenaten's reform as totally heretical and completely out of bounds. So the temples to the Aten were dismantled, and Amarna, the place that Akhenaten purpose built, was abandoned and basically left to crumble to dust until the middle of the 18th century or the late 18th century. Not only this, even Akhenaten's name and all the monuments where he had him and his family carved were removed from public view, and his name was taken out of records. So Tutankhamun basically restored the old polytheism and buried, or almost completely buried, the legacy of Akhenaten, not just the physical structures Akhenaten left behind, but his legacy. So within 20 to 30 years, another pharaoh took over called Horemheb. He was the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, and he completely finished the erasure of Akhenaten. He systemically did the same thing. He got rid of his monuments, removed his name from inscriptions, and took his name out of king lists and attributed Akhenaten's reign to either himself or other pharaohs. So they were absolutely desperate to remove Akhenaten, not just from present consciousness, but they didn't want anyone after them even hearing about him. So Akhenaten's name was omitted from all official records. And this was roughly 1320 to 1290 BC. So there's not a peep about Akhenaten from then until the mid-1800s. I should say there is a fringe opinion that there is one document in between all of these centuries where a heretic or a rebel king is named. Sorry, is not named, but someone is called a heretic or a rebel king, and some Egyptologists have said this is Akhenaten, but it doesn't make any sense because it's completely out of place. Like, there's just one mention of a heretic king. He's not named, no real details are given, and Akhenaten is not mentioned or even hinted at throughout the whole course of Egyptian history, but there is that opinion. So fast forward then to the early 19th century. So European explorers such as John Gardner Wilkinson and Carl Richard Lepsius found the ruins of Amarna, and they documented inscriptions and other things, but they didn't really fully understand their significance. Fast forward then to the late 19th century, there was more systemic excavations of Amarna, led by archaeologists like Flinders Petrie, who uncovered the city's Atenist temples, tombs, and famous Amarna letters, which were diplomatic correspondence. So they managed to confirm Akhenaten's identity then and realize some of his religious reform. And then by the early 20th century, scholars like James Henry Breasted had pieced together his story basically and filled in the details of who this heretic pharaoh was. And his rediscovery was complete. So, yeah, in short, Akhenaten's reforms were geographically limited, centered in Amarna with partial impact in Thebes and possibly Upper Egypt, but they were elite-driven and they didn't penetrate into regular society, as we said. Akhenaten's reign lasted 17 years, with peak implementation between years 5 to 9. As we've seen, he basically was effaced completely after his death. And within 20 to 30 years, this erasure of Akhenaten was complete, 20 to 30 years after his reign. And there's some scholarly comments on this. Brian Fagan, British archaeologist, he says, in contrast, Akhenaten's monotheism developed very largely at the behest of a single absolute monarch presiding over an isolated land where the Pharaoh's word was divine and secular law. It was an experiment that withered on the vine, meaning it died as soon as it sprang up. Another Egyptologist called Helen Chapin-Metz, she says something similar. She says, Akhenaten's religious ideas did not survive his death. To restore the morale of the nation, his successor, Tutankhamun, appeased the offended gods, whose resentment would have blighted all human enterprise. Temples were cleaned and repaired, new images made, priests appointed, and endowments restored. Akhenaten's new city was abandoned to the desert sands. So, as we can see, it's a given, and there's no difference in opinion amongst scholars, Egyptologists, archaeologists, that in space and time, Akhenaten's revolution had little, even no reach. You know, it extended only to the elites, the courtesans during his reign, didn't even filter down to the regular Joes. And it basically died with him. So how then can you realistically propose that he's the father or the originator of monotheism all around the world? You know, the evidence shows us that he got nowhere, essentially. You know, so
right,
yeah. You can combine that then with the first point I made of the evidence of monotheism being original and ancient from various different parts of the world to different extents, and it just becomes really silly to try and uphold the notion that Akhenaten was the father.
right, right. And you know what I felt within what you explained is that his story seems a bit odd than other polytheistic religions, and how generally, you know, a polytheistic society functions. So because of this oddness of this story, I think people are taking this oddness way beyond and then just making a big leap saying, oh, so I found where monotheism came from. This is where monotheism came from. So I'm like, no, yeah, this story is a bit odd from other stories of generally how, like, you know, henotheism or polytheism, which we see in societies, because because the originator, like, you know, of this religion is trying to put a complete totalitarian regime, or like, you know, or something like that. So so I see the jump, like people are jumping that to the origination of monotheism altogether, but we can clearly see, I think, this person is more driven by political reasons, and generally how we see monotheism, we see a lot of difference here. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, he didn't encourage people to worship the Aten as such. He wanted people to go through him. He glorified, if not deified, himself and his family. And as we said, it's quite telling that he was most ferocious against the priesthood of Amun, because they had the most power of all the priesthoods. He was most venomous against them, you know. So as the scholars have said who analysed him, like, he wanted to consolidate like every avenue of power and direct everything to himself. I suppose he had this religious garb. You know, obviously he was hated as well because of what happened after him. You know, other pharaohs were willing to lie and put themselves in his place in the king list or other king lists, as well as smashing down all the his physical legacies.
Right. And, you know, we can expect that if, like, he is proposing in some sense that, you know, every person has to, first of all, they meet that God through me. And, you know, then obviously if that is the thing, once he's going to die, how there is no one is going to carry forward his legacy. And that is not generally how we see how monotheism, I mean, I think has some different kind of organic development than how he's trying to force down his own his own family, like, no, only you connect to God through only me, and I am the intermediary between God. And one more difference I see is that uh, generally when we see, like, someone is proposing monotheism, it's not going to be in stages, slowly, like, if we know the story of the prophets, like, they propose monotheism as it is. But when we see his kind of religious idea was like a slow development in some sense. So James Hofmeyr, he was saying that it is evident that Akhenaten's religious devotion to Aten went through several steps. It was not like suddenly he became monotheist. Initially, at Aten coexisted with traditional cults coupled with neglect, with which was followed by abandonment and etc., etc., etc. And then he says, in the span of less than a decade, Akhenaten's religious intellectual pilgrimage went from polytheism to henotheism or monolatry, and then to monotheism. So you see, like, maybe now if we tie this up with the idea that he's politically driven, so he's slowly seeing how his, his religious idea can benefit him, and then he gets to the last stage. It seems like that to me, at least, that where he's like, okay, now I'll just uh, put forward my God and remove the idea of the other, the other kind of religious figures that have some authority. I want to strip away their authority. So it's better that, I propose this model, which seems somewhat like monotheism, but it's not exactly how we as Muslims believe in Islamic monotheism, or the monotheism of, for example, the major world religions. We see a difference there, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing like those at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Firstly, he has a representation of Aten as the sun disk. Now, some people said that was just a symbolic representation, but nonetheless, this doesn't sync with monotheism.
Exactly, yeah. And there's a picture.
The true prophet never does shirk in their life anyway, even before prophethood. And he was a worshipper of Amun before, hence his previous name. Like, no prophet will ever ask worship to go through them either. And they won't be carving images of themselves and their families underneath the sun disk, the symbol of the Aten, and so on and so forth. Plus, like you say, there's no real, like, the call to monotheism is a call to monotheism from the start. And like Jan Assmann and others said, there's actually no textual refutation of worship of the other gods in the documentation surrounding Akhenaten, which there should have been as well, if it was like a real call to monotheism. Yeah.
Okay.
Plus this elevation, this henotheistic elevation of one god was happening for a long time in Egypt, pre-Akhenaten as well. He just used it as a platform or a vehicle to set up his own totalitarian state, as we said. Like in ancient Egypt, each village or town or even city could have a henotheistic view of one god. And regularly they were parts of triads, not exactly trinities, but the god was worshipped along with a wife and a child. So they were considered to be one and three, so like a triad rather than a trinity. And the status of the gods was changeable. And I've even spoken about this with regards to Babylon, Sumeria, and India. The status of the gods was changeable for political reasons and other reasons as well. Gods were combined, gods got abandoned as well. So you've got similarities in the polytheism, like all over the ancient world. You've got similar reoccurrences. So you got shifting status of gods, combining of gods, attempts to reconcile between various pantheons due to political changes, people just simply favouring one god or one triad over another, so on and so forth. So many analysts of ancient Egyptian religion said it was somewhat monotheistic, with the standard pantheon being emanations or aspects of one supreme God or supreme force, sort of like the Brahman in concept of Hinduism. They are arrayed in a hierarchy, so some of the emanations are actual emanations of other emanations, if that makes sense. And scholars have said that monotheism and polytheism existed side by side in ancient Egypt. If anyone has seen the monotheism video or they want to go back and look at the India section, like the traversing from monotheism to polytheism is easier to identify in India, a lot easier because they have scriptures. They have coded scriptures. Egypt doesn't, which is why you get so many different opinions. Even if the opinions are somewhat similar, like you get loads of different opinions on what Egyptian religion was and what it was in its earliest stages and how it developed, because they have hymns, they have some moral instructions, they have creation stories of a sort, but they have no codified scriptures. Like there's no Rig Veda, there's no Mahabharata, so on and so forth. So it is a lot harder to piece together, and thus you come up with scholars came up with lots of diverse opinions on it. So I'll just start reeling off list of scholars and what they class the Egyptian religion as and how they saw it developing. You have Adolf Ehrman, who subjected his readers to a long list of Egyptian deities. And the reason he did this is because he was trying to refute the idea that ancient Egyptian religion is somewhat monotheistic. And this was in the early 20th century, 1905, because in the late 1800s, there were Egyptologists such as Emmanuel de Rouge, a French Egyptologist and philologist, a British Egyptologist called Peter Renouf, who claimed that ancient Egyptian religion was essentially and fundamentally monotheistic. And Renouf himself said that the many different objects of worship, not just the gods, but the totemistic animals and stuff they worshipped, are a later degeneration of that which was originally the sublime monotheistic faith. I wouldn't go that far exactly myself, but this is what they say.
Wow.
Emmanuel de Rouge, he says, the unity of a supreme and self-existent being, his eternity, his almightiness, and eternal reproduction as God, the attribution of the creation of the world and all living things to the supreme God, the immortality of the soul, completed by dogma of punishment and reward. Such is the sublime and persistent base, which, notwithstanding all deviations and mythological embellishments, must secure for the beliefs of the ancient Egyptians a most honourable place among the religions of antiquity. So later on, a French Egyptologist called Gaston Maspero took the position that polytheism was a secondary phenomenon in Egyptian religion and it had derived from an earlier monotheism.
Oh, wow.
But later on, he recanted and changed his opinion because he found that, as I said, the title one God and only God was applied to several gods in Egyptian history, even when the god was associated with a goddess and a son. And this shifting supremacy I also mentioned in the section on India in the monotheism video as well.
Right.
So, because he saw the conception of the unity as geographical and political as much as it was religious. For example, Ra was the only god of Heliopolis. Amun was the only god of Thebes, and so on. He recanted his opinion. So following him, a number of other writers also did the same. They backtracked on the opinion that the Egyptian religion was originally monotheistic. Polytheism came later. But the matter, it didn't rest there. There was a pushback again. So there was a neotheistic interpretation after that. So it's kind of similar to the story of original monotheism in totality.
Right.
You've got the assumed polytheism as the base of all religions, animism, magism. You've got Lang, you've got pushback on Lang, you've got Schmidt, who added greatly to the work of Lang and pushed back again. So like it kind of echoes the overall it echoes the overall situation of original monotheism as well. So more French Egyptologists then came forward, Etienne Briotton and Jacques Vandier, and they published a political intellectual history simply titled Egypt, which means the Egypt. And they were backed by another German Egyptologist called Siegfried Morenz, who in the 1960s wrote, "There is a single reality of God behind the profusion of his manifestations, and every single deity of Egypt was anchored in the depths of a single divine essence." You have Karl W. Luckert, German scholar of comparative religion. He said Egyptian religion was polytheistic, but with monotheistic tendencies or undercurrents.
Okay.
Such as the concept of a singular divine essence manifesting multiple gods. He didn't endorse monotheism as original, but he did say that there was monotheistic undercurrents or hints. You then have Cornelius Thiele, Dutch theologian for history of religions. He said Egyptian religion was in the beginning polytheistic, but developed in two different directions. In one direction, the gods were multiplied, so polytheism increased, but in the other direction, the Egyptians drew nearer and nearer to monotheism. Jean-Francois Champollion, another French Egyptologist, he believed it to have been a pure monotheism that manifested as a symbolic polytheism. Edward Neville, a Swiss Egyptologist, said it's a religion of nature inclining to pantheism. So you've got other different opinions as well. But for time's sake, there's no point quoting them. Go to a more detailed explanation now. A scholar who has written extensively on Egyptian religion and culture. He's an English Egyptologist and philologist, E.A. Wallace Budge. And he says most of the gods, like Osiris and Ra, are manifestations or phases or attributes of one god. He doesn't class them as separate and distinct gods, but incarnations or manifestations or culminations. So in his opinion, this is aligned with a monotheistic approach. However, to a lay person, it would not seem like this outwardly if you're not familiar with the concept. He says it's not monotheism in a strict sense, but he classes it as a loose type of monotheism. He says it's different from henotheism, since henotheism can be classed as a belief in one supreme God above all the rest, while not denying that there are other lesser divine beings. E.A. Wallace Budge says the Egyptian gods are not distinct from the God, but they are his manifestations or incarnations or both. He then mentions this monotheism popping up and being spliced throughout various different ancient Egyptian texts. He basically says where it come from, we don't know. And there is no evidence whatsoever to guide us in formulating the theory that it was brought into Egypt by immigrants from the East, as some have said, or whether it was a natural product of the indigenous peoples who formed the population of the Nile Valley some 10,000 years ago, which is according to some other opinions. All that is known is that it existed there at a period so remote, it is useless to attempt to measure by years the interval of time which has elapsed since it grew up. And he says, when outsiders took only a brief look and didn't do a deep dive into the Egyptian texts and theology, it could come across that the Neteru, which is plural for gods, or simply evidence that Egypt was engaged in a gross polytheism and nothing more. But for him, he says, it is certain that from the earliest times, one of the greatest tendencies of Egyptian religion was towards monotheism, and this tendency may be observed in all important texts down to the latest period. It is also certain that a kind of polytheism existed in Egypt side by side with monotheism from the earliest times. Which is older, it is useless in our present state of knowledge to inquire.
Wow.
Yeah, as I've said before, as I've said earlier, there's no codified books or scriptures like the Vedas, etc., related to the Egyptian religion. But as more and more hymns to gods and legends of gods and goddesses came down to people, it became easier to arrive at certain conclusions about the Egyptian religion and its general character. Thus, Egyptologists debated whether it's monotheistic, henotheistic, polytheistic, or even pantheistic. Gerry Coghlan, an Egyptologist, another Egyptologist, excuse me, he says a very distinctive feature of ancient Egyptian religion is that any one of the main deities could, on any particular occasion, be the supreme being. A deity was a supreme being in his or her own temple, and each deity was addressed in prayer by a priest or devotee as if they were the only supreme being. The same practices can be found in Hinduism today, which is exactly what I spoke before. And Horning applied the terms monolatry and henotheism to these practices. Now go back to Jan Assmann, another German Egyptologist. There is a text called the Teachings of Merikare, in which Jan Assmann, he translates a particular word here. It's called neter. Like neteru means gods. Neter in singular is the singular term. I suppose you could say it's like God. What the actual meaning of the word is disputed. Some say it's related to being holy. Some say it's related to power, strength. Some say it's related to creation, restoration. Some say it's related to eternality. Well, whatever translation you take, it has divine connotations. Now, in the Teaching of Merikare, which is the text Assmann analyzes, he translates neter as God with a capital G. Other scholars have chosen to do this with other texts. I don't always agree with that translation. We'll see why they chose to do that in a little bit. But commenting on the Teaching of Merikare, Assmann says, this text is not only an extremely human-centered view of creation, it is also a monotheistic view of the divine. The text speaks of God, other gods are not mentioned. And Assmann here renders neter as God with a capital G through his own translation of the passage, and others have agreed with him here. I'm not necessarily saying I do, here or elsewhere, but he, commenting on this, then others have said that since the Old Kingdom, Egyptian religion harbored the philosophical roots of monotheism. Most significant is what Assmann terms cosmogonic monotheism, where there is a single primordial creator deity out of whom or by whom the rest of the pantheon are born or created. Again, that echoes some of the mythology of Babylon and Sumeria and other places.
Right.
They say to call this genuine monotheism would be at best a forced expansion of the term. The very texts which venerate a certain god as the father or creator of other deities also promote the worship of offspring gods. There may have been one god in the primordial past, but the actual practice of Egyptian religion was always polytheistic. To call it true monotheism is misleading. So we can see that regardless of Akhenaten, there have been somewhat monotheistic hints or undercurrents or remnants in Egypt anyway. So we have Akhenaten's revolution himself being a failure, basically having no effect in space and time beyond him and after him. We have the evidence from all around the world outside of Egypt to show that monotheism is more ancient and original. We have looked at Egyptian theology somewhat to show that these kind of monotheistic or henotheistic notions, they pop up anyway. And I just want to highlight one or two more ancient documents. Now, like I said, Neter basically means God in the singular. And it has been applied regularly to Osiris or Ra or Amun, like you can call them Neter. Is Neteru plural. However, there is an unnamed Neter in the singular mentioned in a number of the ancient documents. And both Christian scholars and secular scholars have sometimes chosen to translate this as God with a capital G.
Okay, wow.
Why? Because these texts, they give a framework for moral behavior, and that this moral behavior is guided by the unnamed Neter, and people are accountable to Neter. And rather than being like a mythological god like Horus or Osiris, they saw this Neter as being an actual divine principle or force. So some scholars, they use God with a capital G to reflect the gravitas of the unnamed Neter in comparison to the other Neteru. You get it?
Yeah, that's a very interesting.
But this more often happened with the ancient, the older Egyptologists. Modern Egyptologists tend to leave Neter untranslated or translated as the divine or the God or deity.
But yeah, the God is also something.
Because they view it as more
tradition.
Yeah, they view it as more henotheistic rather than monotheistic, so they don't want to put God with a capital G. So according to their understanding. But there's one very interesting document. It's called the Instructions or the Maxims of Ptahhotep. Like we said, there's mixture of polytheism and monotheistic hints in the document. The name itself means the god. Ptahhotep is the name of the author. Ptah was one of the polytheistic pantheon gods, and Hotep means pleased. So you do have mention of other gods like Osiris here and there in the document. But the document is dated to the oldest copies from 2500 BC, but it may, due to various reasons, scholars have said that it was composed probably around 3000 BC originally. Earlier scholars dated it even earlier, but their opinion seems to have been overturned. Like I said, many scholars, Christian and secular, have translated Neter in this document as God with a capital G. I will just say Neter instead of God, but I'll read out some of the precepts. Thou shalt not make neither man nor woman to be afraid, for Neter is opposed thereto. And if any man shall say that he will live thereby, Neter will make him to want bread. As for the nobleman who possesses an abundance of goods, he may act according to his own dictates, and he may do with himself that which he pleases. If he will do nothing at all, this is as he pleases. The nobleman, by merely stretching out his hand, does that which mankind cannot attain to. But inasmuch as the eating of bread is according to the plan of Neter, this cannot be disputed. If thou wilt put yourself in the service of a perfect man, your conduct shall be fair before Neter. If thou want to be a wise man, make your son pleasing unto Neter. Satisfy those who depend upon you as far as you are able to do so. This should be done by those whom Neter has favoured. If, having been of no account, being unknown previously, you have become great, and if, after having been poor, you become rich, and if thou hast become governor of a city, do not be hard-headed on account of your advancements or improvements, because you have merely become the guardian of the things which Neter has provided. What is loved of Neter is obedience. Neter hates disobedience. Assuredly, a good son is of the gifts of Neter. The things which Neter does cannot be known. Terrify not men, Neter is opposed thereto. When you go to plough, labour in the field that Neter has given you. So that's probably the strongest. There's more mention of the unnamed Neter in that document as well, but that's probably the strongest one. And like I said, many scholars, they translate Neter there as God with a capital G, and they've done so again in another document. It's called the Instructions of Ani. It's not as old as the Maxims of Ptahhotep. It's dated to around 1300 BC, so it's not too far off Akhenaten's time, actually. And just some short lines from this one. Neter magnifies his name. What the house of Neter hates is much speaking. Pray with a loving heart all the petitions which are in secret. He will perform thy business. He will hear that which thou says and will accept your offerings. Neter decrees that which is right. If your mother raises her hands to Neter, he will hear her prayers and rebuke you. When thou makest an offering unto thy Neter, guard thou against the things which are an abomination unto him. Behold his plans with your eye, and devote yourself to the adoration of his name. He gives souls unto millions of forms, and him that magnifies him, he will also magnify. So,
wow.
There's actually quite a few ancient documents with an unnamed Neter in them as well, with similar statements. Like I said, I don't always agree that it should be translated as God with a capital G. However, when you piece everything together, you can see that there is a monotheistic base, at least to some extent, in the ancient Egyptian religion. When you clear away all the soil and all the dirt of the polytheism there, you get to something which is a bit more lofty, because these kind of instructions, like, you don't find, you simply don't find them in the texts related to the other polytheistic pantheons as well. Because they are moral instruction, that's also one of the reasons why the scholars have translated Neter as God.
Yeah, but then this what you were reading was actually like, I could feel, this feels like, this is something close to monotheism. And much more. And to be very honest, this within our whole discussion, I think this part was my favorite, because now I was not within our discussion, I was not knowing that we would also touch on the history of monotheism versus polytheism in the whole Egyptian civilization. We would go so back and see. So yes, there is a debate, there is a difference of opinion, a lot is there. But the fact that there are remnants of monotheism itself is a very big point against the whole Akhenaten kind of claim. It just becomes completely baseless when you see that there are already debates going on if monotheism was the original starting point for the whole for the religions of the Egyptian civilization. Now, if we keep that and we see, okay, so there is a lot of remnants there of a supreme being, of a God, and you also highlight how moral obedience is also connected to that God in some sense, which is generally how monotheistic traditions function. And then when we look into other civilizations, we see a similar pattern. In some civilizations more clear, like the Sumerian civilization or the Indian civilization, is much more clear that it goes back to very close to monotheism. Now we see something similar in the Egyptian civilization, and then in all of this, if we try to put picture of original monotheism and seeing that, okay, if monotheism was the original religion of mankind, and we are finding remnants in the Egyptian civilization, in the Chinese civilization, in the Indus Valley civilization, and also in the Sumerian civilization. So this paints a clear picture of monotheism being primal, not in some sense, but actually, like, from a holistic perspective, then the case becomes very strong. This is what I can see. Yeah, what would you say about that?
Yeah, exactly. Like, the reason why I said monotheism being primal from around the world is enough of a refutation of Akhenaten, is simply because of this. So in the video, I just wanted to focus on him, evidence from outside of Egypt, but evidence, internal Egyptian evidence as well.
Yeah.
You know, so you have these monotheistic undercurrents or remnants or legacies there, regardless of Akhenaten. So even within the framework of Egyptian history, it's impossible he was the first monotheist.
Yeah.
But then when we piece it all together, like you said, we've got evidence from Egypt, we got evidence from India, we got evidence from China, we got evidence from Persia, we got evidence from various different indigenous tribes all around the world, from South America to the North Americas to Africa to the Australian Aborigines and other more obscure locations as well. Like I said, if we run backwards along the course of history, archaeology and anthropology, in these places, like, you either find a clear monotheism, which the evidence of Sumeria, for example, suggests. You find a vastly reduced polytheism, like India. You find monotheistic mention in the oldest books in China, the oldest known books of China, and this mention disappears in the later books. So again, we have evidence that monotheism is more ancient, polytheism is later development. If you look at the method of Wilhelm Schmidt, you'll see how he divided up cultures into their various different ages, and those on the primitive, which is the term he used for the ethnologically oldest cultures, they evidence much more pure kind of religious faith, so to say. May not exactly be monotheistic, but their concept of a supreme God is more vivid, and they are far less polytheistic. So when you put everything together, like, the case is clear for monotheism being original, which is the Islamic position anyway, undisputed by consensus based on very clear texts, you know.
Right. Subhanallah, yeah. So this was really enjoyable for me, because now I got to learn something new in this discussion, is more about the history of the Egyptian religions as well, which itself has remnants of monotheism, which I think I found that to be really profound. Alhamdulillah. Yeah, so inshallah we'll end this discussion here, and I guess I would tell my audience a few things. They have to stay tuned, because I think Brother Gerry has more interesting stuffs coming some other day, inshallah. We wouldn't talk about it now, but yes, there are some interesting topics that inshallah is going to come soon. So stay tuned, and Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.